אז אנחנו מתחילים, להיות בה,
So we're going to start. My name is Dr. Carl Yonker. I'm a researcher at the center and the media director, and I will be the moderator today. Welcome to our third discussion group, the war in the Ukraine, universal aspects and Jewish aspects. We're happy that you have joined us today. We're talking about a very important subject this evening. There are two notes before we start. I ask that you please put yourself on mute during the lectures. And also later on, the translation of the lectures will be available in English. And we will put them up on our website. So with that, we would like to start with the opening words from Professor Dina Porat, the Jewish world and Putin's war crimes. Dina Porat is the founder of the center and a professor at Tel Aviv University and the main historian at Yad Vashem. So please, Dina. Thank you. Thank you, Carl. Thank you to Professor Uriya Shavit. Thank you to Dr. Giovanni Kerr, who planned this event. And thank you, obviously, to all those who are joining us. It is my honor to start with opening words. I will touch on the connection between what's happening in the Ukraine and Jewish aspects. And the first attribute and the most intensive one is the thought of concepts and associations and connections to the Holocaust. And I will open with the concepts and then the associations and then a few more connections that time has caused. First, this was the opening of the Ukraine ambassador in Israel, to Israel. The fact that many Ukrainians saved Jews during the Holocaust. I'm sorry, I don't understand Russian.
קארל, מה קורה? אוקיי.
Okay, I'm going to continue. This was the opening words of the Ukrainian ambassador to Israel when he spoke about the fact that many Ukrainian people saved Jews during the Holocaust. And he quoted a number and he said the number of the righteous among the nations is number 4 in size in the list, Yad Vashem's list. And these words caused a lot of interest, a lot of complaints and grudges. And I would like to touch on this as my opening for the debate about what is happening in Ukraine and the concepts during the Holocaust. So yes, he quoted a correct number. About 2,760 something Ukrainians did get this medal, this title from Yad Vashem, but there has to be a proportion. There were, for example, in the Netherlands, 1,600 Jews, and Yad Vashem gave about 6,000 titles of the righteous among the nations to people in Holland, while in Ukraine there was 1.5 million Jews, and therefore this number of 2,760 is not in proportion to the number of Jews. And another concept, what actually happened here? He tried to tie between these cases of saving lives in the Holocaust and the need to save lives in the Ukraine. And we are here not to give advice and say what we need to do or not, but of course, what we need to do has no connection. It does not depend on what Ukrainians did or some people did during the Holocaust. These are two separate concepts, and we have to think about them separately. The Jewish history has been forgotten, so if we touch on it, even if we shortly count it from the Tachvetat riots in the 1700s and the Negev storms in 1881 and Kishinev riots in 1903-4, what happened right after the First World War, and the Ukrainian people and the way they assisted the German people during the Holocaust. The Jews in Ukraine, they looked just like everybody else and you couldn't identify them. The Germans needed their help, the citizens' help, in order to go and find them. An important research says, based on German documents, that the number of informants on the Jews was so large that the Germans could not handle it. And therefore, the things that he said opened the debate and need to be put in proportion. And with that, and everything that we've noted, there was a rich history, a rich Jewish history with personalities and people who created and worked, mainly in Odessa, but in every important Jewish center. And also they worked through generations through these events. And I will continue to President Zelensky, his speech at the Knesset, and he also touched on the righteous among the nations, on this number, and he added that during the Holocaust there was a lot of choices. Of course there were choices. I will go back to my last point, that a lot of Ukrainians did make the choice not to help, but rather to help those that were persecuting the Jews. I would like to remind you that the Germans used the Ukrainian people to be guards at the concentration camps. They didn't take anybody else. They didn't choose the Polish people, but they chose the Ukrainians to be guards. Zelensky also touched on a phrase that he thinks Putin used, and that is the final solution. Apparently he did not use it. There are people who follow the way Putin talks and the expressions he uses in order to understand what's going on in his mind. But he did not use this phrase as a term to kill all the people of Ukraine. maybe he used it as a final result in the war and the battles. And so these expressions, these phrases need to be checked and be kept in proportion to what is happening in reality, including what Putin himself opened with of denazifying of Ukraine. Again, this is a phrase that is taken from the Holocaust, and he's touching on Ukraine being a Nazi country, and even this needs to be taken in proportion and in the correct context. The second subject is the subject of associations. We said you cannot compare with the Holocaust. The Holocaust was unique, it was unprecedented, it happened across all of Europe. These are different events. And I think we all know the differences. But the associations, they're not a comparison. And the associations that come to any Jewish person's mind when they see, for example, refugees, convoys of refugees, mainly women who are carrying children and babies. They're walking in the snow, in the cold. The association to the refugee status the Jews were in so many times through history, it comes up. The pictures of destruction, what we saw yesterday, the murder of civilians, of people who are tied up. If you remember the Catalan massacre, that the officers were tied up and were shot behind their head. These are associations that come up. I'm not comparing, but these associations come up. Once I was asked if there's an emotional lesson that I take with me after so many years of working about the Holocaust, and there's one thing that has come up to my mind, that when you read so many memoirs of people who survivors, there's one thing that comes up and it repeats itself, and it's very scary, and it is how the lives of people, doesn't matter where or how, it's how their lives flip in 1 second and they end in a second. And this is what we see again. Ukrainian people who turn to the camera and say, where are our lives, where are our usual lives? These lives that ended in 1 second. And these associations, I repeat and I say, they're not a comparison. They are inevitable throughout all of these events. And the third topic, after using the concepts and the need for proportion and associations, I would like to touch on another question that always comes up between those that research anti-Semitism. When a dramatic event breaks out, usually it doesn't take more than 48 hours after a tsunami or earthquake or some financial crash. And then the blaming of Jewish people, sometimes named, sometimes as a group, a national group, those that support Israel, and of course Israel. But as far as we have checked, and the diaspora office has checked, and an organization of hundreds of students that check on the internet, as far as we've seen, there are not a lot of accusations of this type, but in the last week, there are a few accusations that have come up, caricatures, like, for example, character of an Israeli soldier or hooligan with a flag of Russia, and in front of him, the same hooligan soldier with a Ukrainian flag, as if there's Israeli vested interest in this war. But for now, I would say this is not the center of the issue. I may be proved wrong, or the situation will stay as is, but I emphasize also in the Ukraine and in Russia in the past years, there are very low incidents of anti-Semitism compared to Western Europe, including violence. There are no Muslims there. There's no issue of anti-Zionism because of this presence of Muslims, and let's just hope that this continues. I will finish with the survivors and the righteous among the nations. Such an irony of fate is hard to find. Jewish people who are survivors, who are living in the Ukraine, are being rescued, and a few of them, where have they been rescued to? To Germany. If there is irony, it's here. And another thing, Yad Vashem is bringing to Israel descendants of these righteous among the nations. Obviously, a lot of them are no longer alive, but Yad Vashem is making an effort to bring these descendants of the righteous to Israel and to care for them as part of what we can do in these days. Obviously, we are all part of the shock, the condemnation of the way this country has been attacked and the destruction, and here we try to bring the connection and the Jewish side of this picture. And again, I would like to thank the organizers and those who are present here. Thank you. Thank you, Dina. We will now move on to our first lecturer of the evening, Dr. Evgeni Klauber. Dr. Klauber is a lecturer in the political science department in Tel Aviv University. He's also the director of the Francis Brody Institute for Applied Diplomacy, and he's a desired commentator both in Israel and abroad. Today he will talk about the President Zelensky and about Jewish and Ukrainian identity. So thank you.
שלום, שומעים? שלום. שומעים? האם שומעים? שלום.
כן, שומעים.
יופי. אז אוקיי, אז תודה רבה, דינה.
So hello, thank you, Dina. That was very interesting. I just wanted to add to your point that Putin did not say the phrase final solution, and these are words that were not in his speech. Instead, he did speak about the Jewish question, and obviously that is a much larger question, and the Jewish question did not always end with a final solution. This has always been a philosophical question, but he did talk about the Jewish question, and the phrase final solution was not heard in his speech. What I wanted to show you is Zelensky's complex and interesting identity. That today, being Ukrainian is not really connected to a nation. Today, in the global age, it's more of a set of mind. Today, when we see the Ukrainian flag decorating cities in Europe, after the murder in Bucha yesterday, we all feel a little Ukrainian. But this identity in postmodern times is very complex. And when we see Zelensky's interviews and asking him about his Jewish identity, he clearly says that his Jewish identity is not his main identity. It turns out that the Jewish Zelensky is more Ukrainian than a lot of Ukrainians. But his connection to his Jewishness still remains. We'll see a few points from his interviews, but we see that you can be in the Ukraine. As Dina said, there's very low anti-Semitism there.
They would not accept Jews as fellow citizens.
And we see here the anti-Semitism rate. We see those that are leading are Germany and Lithuania, Belarus and Russia with 13-14%. And Ukraine, in surprising manner, is only 5%. So from all these countries that participated in the survey, is least anti-Semitic. I would like to describe how in the Ukraine in the last 30 years, a specific kind of nationality was formed, what allowed a Jewish president in a country that obviously we do not deny that it had a history of anti-Semitism and that Ukrainians participated in crime against the Jews. So there is this interesting sentence. Putin does not like Zelensky. It's an understatement when we see what's happening around us. But there are categories of frenemies. The categories of Carl Schmitt, us versus them, a friend versus an enemy. And a frenemy is not based on love or hate, but rather an option of fighting. A friend is somebody who is with me, and Carl Schmitt says an enemy is somebody that I fight against. It's not somebody that I hate. The love-hate relationship belongs in a different realm. So here, we have a weird category. So we have hate, but love is opposed to hate. And here we have a statement does not like, does not love. So it's not hate and it's not love. So when we have love and what opposes it is hate, so here we have a third situation. Does not like. When we talk about Zelensky, we don't talk about Zelensky specifically. We have heard Putin say horrible things about Zelensky. He called him a drug addict, and we called him a Nazi. Dina mentioned this when she spoke, but there's something deeper. Putin does not like the collective Zelensky and what he represents. And here the word does not like. In the time of the Soviet Union and the imperialism, this was a statement that they used towards the Jews. You'll never hear Putin say anti-Semitic words. On the contrary, he has come to save the Jews in the Ukraine, and he declares this. Putin in 2014, he said, this is a country that's becoming a Nazi country and we have to save the Jews. Putin will never say anti-Semitic statements. Obviously, Putin's close surroundings are all Jewish, whether in the media, like Yaakov Kedmi and Solovyov and people like the Rothenberg brothers, who are oligarchs who are closest to the government. Obviously, he cannot say anti-Semitic rhetoric. But when we try to understand how Putin relates to Ukraine, he does not like them, just like the Jewish people were not liked in history. And that's why this third category of does not like fits here. Why is there a contradiction here? Because on one side, he talks about one nation, and he comes to save them. And here on the slide, you can see his famous article that was published in 2021 in July, and I highlighted here. He does not believe in the Ukrainian nation. There is no such thing. Once he said, and I quote, that the Ukrainian people did not fight for their sovereignty, they picked it up from the floor. In the 90s, the sovereignty was easy to take and they picked it up from the floor. He does not consider them a nation. This is also one of the problems and failures of this operation. He realized they were not only a nation, they're a nation that will defend themselves, because he hoped that within 72 hours he'll have a flag in Kiev and they'll accept him with flowers. Putin's soldiers went in with formal uniforms. They expected a parade. So instead of having stocks of fuel for prolonged fighting, he himself was convinced that this would be a short operation and that he would enter Kiev as a Victorian, and he did not take into account this big thing. So on one hand, a nation that he does not love, but love and not loving, so he's saving them out of love. This is a new situation. So even when we think about Hitler, Hitler killed the Jews from hate. Here is a different story. He is saving them from this neo-Nazi regime out of love, out of this one nation, and this is something that repeats itself. Recently, I've seen in the literature this theoretical model that can explain the situation of love/hate. This situation of a joker. There's an article here that you can see on the screen. An article that talks about Zelensky as a joker. What is a joker? It's a theoretical concept that is taken from Carl Jung. He was Freud's student, and he came up with this concept to show a character, a figure that has in him good and bad, subjective and objective, a joker in a pack. Once you have a joker, you have to actually show your cards. And Zelensky is a joker, so is Putin, because by this joker, we see the values of the world. Ukraine is a mirror of the global politics. When we look at Ukraine, we can see the weaknesses of NATO, the place of America in the global politics. We see China's place that is taking a bigger and bigger place, and they are managing this from afar, because obviously they have a lot of interest in the Ukraine. This is Carl Schmitt, and this is the joker. Here Putin is depicted as a joker, and he kept saying that Ukraine's president is a joker, but Putin himself is a joker. Actually, there's two jokers.
את הטוב והרע.
They both
ג'וקר זה
combine the
קטגוריה
good and the
פוסט-מודרנית.
bad.
פול רדין כתב ספר
Paul
מצוין על
Radin
הטריקסטר,
wrote a book about the trickster.
דמות שקיימת במיתולוגיה
He's a
של
figure that
אומות
exists
רבות,
in the
שלמעשה
mythology of a lot of
בא
nations,
לפתוח את הקלפים.
and he actually comes to
עכשיו,
get you to open your cards.
רגע. ניגשים למסכות, אז
When
שוב
we
פעם,
turn to
ג'וקר גורם לנו להוריד מסכות.
the
אנחנו רואים
masks, the Joker makes us take
שמסכה
off our
אחרי
masks.
מסכה, אנחנו מזהים את
Mask
העולם
after
המערבי,
mask,
את
we
הערכים
identify
והתשלומים
the Western
שקיימים
world
בפוליטיקה המודרנית.
and the values in the modern
לגבי
politics.
היהדות של זלנסקי,
About
והדרישה
Zelensky's
שלו
Jewishness and his
הדרישה שלו
demands
מישראל.
from Israel.
עכשיו, הוא התראיין לאיזשהו
He was
עיתון,
interviewed for some newspaper,
שאלו אותו כמה שאלות
and they
לגבי
asked him a
היהדות
few
שלו.
questions about his
הנה למשל
Jewishness.
כאן יש לכם, אתם רואים 4
Here, for
שאלות,
example,
זה
he
שאלה
was asked 4
ראשונה
questions, and this is
שהוא
the first
נשאל
question that he
על
was
החיים
asked
כיהודי בתקופה של
about
ברית
the
המועצות,
life during the
והוא אומר
Soviet
שם
Union
כמה דברים
period,
שפשוט לא מדויקים
and he says a
ברמה
few things
ההיסטורית, לא
that are
מדויקים ברמה הפוליטית.
historically and
מה שהוא
politically
אומר, religion did not
inaccurate.
exist
He says
in the
religion
Soviet
didn't
Union
exist
as
in the
such.
Soviet state as such.
כששאלו אותו
And this was when he was asked, the question was if he had an ordinary Soviet Jewish upbringing.
והוא אומר משהו שהוא לא מדויק.
And he says something that is
כמובן
inaccurate.
שיהדות הייתה קיימת,
Of course,
היא פשוט הייתה קיימת
Jewishness did exist,
ברמת החברה האזרחית.
but it only existed in civil society.
החברה האזרחית שהחילו להופיע בסוף שנות
towards the end of the 70s, the early 80s, and that's actually the years where he was a child growing up.
אני זוכר את זה אפילו ממשפחה שלי.
I remember even from my family that there were synagogues, and now we're approaching Passover. We celebrated Passover. There are barely people who came out from the Soviet Union who doesn't know what Passover is, so this is actually inaccurate. This is his family. They were more secular, and that's a different story. And that's a personal story. The father is an engineering professor, and maybe in those institutes where he worked, he really did need to hide his Jewish identity. It's important to state, and I think this is an important fact in his bibliography that is not mentioned a lot, is that in first grade, the family moved to Malaysia for one of the father's projects. It was a scientific project, and they are there for 4 years, from first to fourth grade. These years are really forming years. So maybe especially abroad, these Jewish practices of a family that are close to diplomats, close to the establishments, are abroad, and maybe this is what explains that he didn't have Jewish practices. The second question, Zelensky is from Kriveri. And this was the only city that Jews could live in. And there, the Jewish practices did happen. And now there is a Jewish community there. So to say that there is no Jewish life is not inaccurate. But there were other inaccuracies. For example, in the first sentence, he said that the Jews and the Ukrainians always lived peacefully side by side. I don't want to repeat this because Dina touched on this. On local collaboration, those Ukrainians who helped the Nazis. Obviously, I wasn't invited, but if I was his speechwriter, I would be very careful of these generalizations. Or at least in that speech that he spoke to the Knesset, I would touch on the element that we are aware that the Ukrainians caused grief to the Jewish people. And then in the fourth question, he talks about the weight of his Jewishness in his identity. And he quotes from Bernard Henry Levy, who says, from all my faults, in my, obviously he's talking ironically here, to quote what he says, the fact that I am Jewish barely makes 20 in my long list of faults.
The fact that I'm Jewish barely makes 20 in my long list of faults.
Zelensky doesn't by chance quote him, and he wants to show that his, the component of this Jewishness in his identity is not a whole. And here, the German philosopher Werner Sombart, in his famous book about the hero and merchant, Handler and Helden, he describes a situation where the nation is transformed. So a nation can be a nation of merchants, but then after a transformation, it becomes a nation of heroes. And here, the hero, when we look at Zelensky, for example, he's a hero not because of his personal traits. When we look at his biography, we don't see anything profound. We don't see that he was in the army or did anything that would grant him the title of a hero. But a hero as a function. This book about the hero and merchant talks about structural philosophy. So there was changes and functions were opened, and he entered into a function of a hero. So it doesn't matter which leader was standing there, he just entered this space of a hero. And that's why most of the cartoonists draw him as a superhero. The internet, for example, is filled with such cartoons. Zelensky is a trickster who reveals the weaknesses of the West. I need ammunition, not a ride. This too became viral because here he blames the Biden administration that they actually knew about the invasion. And Biden, 2 days before the invasion, they moved the embassy, stating that they do not recognize the sovereignty of the Zelensky government in Kiev. This was a strong statement. And 2 days later, Biden offers Zelensky tickets. He offers him refuge because it was obvious that in a few hours Ukraine would fall. And this too was one of the weaknesses of the intelligence. Everybody talks about the CIA, that they knew that Russia would invade, but the CIA did not know how weak the Russian army was, how corrupt it was. And the CIA did not evaluate properly the Ukrainian motivation and abilities, and this became clear after a few days of fighting. So the ticket to the US became irrelevant. This request to be a government in exile. These are practices that are acceptable of governments in exile. And here another trickster who reveals another weakness, NATO's weakness. All Zelensky is asking for is an umbrella. An umbrella against the aerial capabilities of Russia. And NATO is afraid, claiming that it will make them go into a third world war, which is obviously a false claim. NATO was formed in order to fight for democracy. And here we have a democracy, and if Ukraine wins, and they have already won in many aspects, in symbolical aspects, and they are also pushing the Russian army back to the border in some places.
המדינות
But the
מחוץ
countries
לנאטו,
outside
שייכנסו
NATO
עכשיו לברית
that
חזקה
are going
שזה
to
בטח פולין,
come together in strong alliances,
15-20 מדינות
like
שזלנסקי
Poland
מדבר
and
עליהן,
15-20 other countries that Zelensky is talking to.
זה למעשה ברית חדשה,
This is a new
שיהיה בה
alliance
כמובן את פולין,
that will have in
יהיו
it
בה מדינות
Poland,
בלטיות,
there will be other
זה
Baltic
למעשה אותן
countries.
מדינות
These are actually
שמרגישות את
the
האיום של
countries
התוקפן,
that are
נאטו
feeling
מאוד
the
מהסס,
threat
נאטו
of the
טוען
attacker. NATO
שהכניסה יוביל
is
אותו
hesitant,
למהלך
claiming
מלחמת העולם השלישי,
that
שזה
if they
כמובן
enter, it will
שטות,
make
וזה
them go
סטנדרטים
into a third world
כפולים,
war, and of
מכיוון
course this is
שב-8
nonsense.
לאוגוסט 2008,
On the 8th
בים
of
השחור,
August 2008, in the Black
בוש
Sea,
הבן
when
נותן פקודה
George Bush Jr. gives a
לאונייה
command
בשם מקפול
for a
להיכנס
ship
לים
by the name of
השחור,
McFall to
וארצות
enter the
הברית היא
Black
מדינת
Sea,
נאטו,
and
תוך
the US
12 שעות, שימו לב
is
למספר
part
הזה,
of NATO,
תוך 12
within
שעות,
12 hours,
פוטין, רוסיה מוציאה את כוחותיה
Putin and
מג'ורג'יה.
Russia pull
ולא
out their
היה שום
forces
מלחמת
from
העולם
Georgia,
השלישי,
and there was no world
וברגע
war.
שעוצרים את רוסיה
Once you
בכוח,
stop
היא נעצרת,
Russia
שם היא
forcefully,
נעצרת.
that's
זאת
where
אומרת,
it
רוסיה
stops.
תיעצר,
Russia
איפה
will
שיעצרו
stop
אותה.
where they stop her.
והתקוות הכזב,
And these false
תחת
hopes
סעיף בירוקרטי
that
של
NATO
נאטו,
has
לא לעזור למדינת
not to
אוקראינה,
help Ukraine
יוביל לסיטואציה שהיום
will
אנחנו
lead to a
חושבים,
situation
האם
where
בכלל
today we are even thinking,
אוקראינה תשקול להכניס
is
את
the
נאטו
Ukraine
לברית
even going to
החדשה? האם
think
בכלל נאטו
to
שווה את
allow
אוקראינה? לא הפוך.
the
הרי כל
NATO
הדיונים
in, not
עד
the other
כמה
way around?
אוקראינה יכולה
All the
להיכנס
debate is,
לנאטו.
can Ukraine enter
ושקף
NATO,
אחרון
but the
שלי
discussion
הוא
will be
למעשה,
the other way around.
רגע,
And my
שקף
last
אחרון,
slide,
יש לי עוד 3-4 דקות?
do I have a few more
כן.
minutes?
אז אני רוצה להגיד,
So I would like to explain, in literature there are two types of nations, and this is a summary of everything that I've already said, but last slide with main points. The Ukrainian nationalism is more civil, while the Russian nationalism is an ethnic one. So in the Ukraine, a state creates the nation. There was a state, and it created a nation with flags and symbols of sovereignty. But in Russia, it was the other way around. The nation manifested itself into a sovereign empire. First, there was a nation. In the Ukraine, what's trying to be created is a liberal nationalism, while in Russia, we talk about the ethnic nationalism with an effort to build a Russian super ethnos. A super ethnos empire. The Ukrainian nationalism is inclusive and tolerant, and that's why the Ukraine is very tolerant towards issues like the LGBT community, while in Russia, nationalism is exclusive and assimilative. In the Ukraine, there's a basis of bloodshed. Are you willing to shed blood for this principle? It doesn't matter where you come from. I saw this Canadian soldier who is in the Ukraine, and he is shooting endlessly. In Russia, is shooting Russians endlessly. But the question is, are you willing to shed blood for Ukraine? You can be one of us. In Russia, it's not about bloodshed, it's about blood share. You have to have the DNA. In the Ukraine, there's the principle of salad, that each one keeps their identity. That's why a phenomenon like Zelensky is possible, because he holds on to his Jewishness. In Russia, there is a stew where you are forced to give up your identity and become Russian. In the Ukraine, there is a focus on individual, and in Russia, the focus is a group. It is worth dying for this group. That's what Putin says. It is worth dying for the group. In the Ukraine, the rights are sacred. it's a liberal democracy. And in Russia, we talk about duties. Duties. You have to listen. You are a slave to this nation. In the Ukraine, it's constructed versus primordial. In the Ukraine, it's more artificial, whereas in Russia, it's more real and substantial. In the Ukraine, there is more universalism. The Ukraine pushes forward a state of all its citizens, while in Russia, we push forward a nation state. This Russian super ethnos. And my last point, in the Ukraine, we see fighters. This is very important to distinguish between fighters and soldiers. In Russia, we see soldiers. In the Ukraine, we see fighters. They are equipped with the newest weapons that they got from NATO. They have motivation. This is their land, and they are fighting for their principles. Whereas in Russia, there are soldiers that are listening to their orders. These are Soviet soldiers. Who are, from what I've heard, raping 3,000 cases of women being raped. They are listening to the orders in the old Soviet way. The drivers of the tank are sitting on stools. These are soldiers. They are not equipped. Putin ordered them to self-supply. So whatever you steal from a supermarket or the apartments of Ukrainians, this is what you will eat. You have no source to your supplies. They have no autonomy. They have generals and they comply to authority. The difference between a soldier and fighter. The fighters are the ones that shed the blood. The soldiers are the ones who go like a herd to a mission, on a mission, for a government that has ideologies, and they never understand what they are doing there. And this is the reason why there are so many refuseniks, why so many people are giving themselves in, because they find themselves as refugees in Europe, and they do this as a rational thing. Some of them are just giving themselves in. They do not act like fighters. I think I've exceeded my time. I feel like I have a lot of things I could talk about, but I've given here some main points between the Russians and the Ukrainian in this war. Thank you, Dr. Klauber. And now I would like to invite the next speaker, Dr. Dina Shtakser. She is a researcher in Yad Vashem and also in our center. She is the author of Making of Jewish Revolutionaries in the Pale of Settlement, which was published in 2014. Tonight, Dr. Shtakser will talk about ethnic and political identities in the war for Ukraine. So, Dr. Shtakser, please.
Shama? Shama? Dina? טוב. אז
הנה במיוט, צריך
כן,
טוען
אני מנסה.
מיוט.
אני מנסה. לא יודע מה קורה פה. טוב, במקום זה, אז
So
אנחנו
instead of that, we will move on to our next speaker,
שלישית. קסניה סבטלובה.
Ksenia Svetlova.
קסניה היא חברת כנסת לשעבר.
Is a former Knesset member for the Zionist Union,
מאוד חסרה לנו
and her absence from the Knesset these days is notable.
עכשיו היא עמיתית
She is now a senior research fellow at the Institute for Policy and Strategy, and she's an expert in the extreme Islam and modern Egypt. Tonight, she will talk about the immigrants from Russia and the Ukraine in light of the war. So hello, I apologize for the delay. Just most of the family has fallen sick with COVID, and I am the only one left to care for them. So I was just able to join you just now, and I missed the lectures before me, but I'm sure they were fascinating. So just a quick diagnosis, an immediate diagnosis of what is happening in the last month and a half. Firstly, the big difference and change between the situation, whether they're ex-Ukrainian and ex-Russian, between now and what happened in 2014. It's a big difference. This is a microcosm that is happening amongst Russian speakers, ex-Russia and Ukraine in Israel, but this is happening around the world. This debate on who is right, what really happened, and how do we continue from here. This is all different from what happened in 2014. Yes, there was a violent act of invasion. There is some mic that's on. But there was a violent act, but it did not involve violence, as opposed to what's happening now, starting the 24th of February, when life is divided into before and after. These communities see this as a red line that separates between different eras and periods. And this is perceived as breaking of international law, breaking of morals, ethics, principles, in every aspect. If in 2014, and it continued in 2015 and 2016, this question of who owns Crimea, the Crimea Peninsula, what really is happening in the Ukraine. What is the fate of the national battalions like Azov in this army, in this military of the Ukraine? And what is their fate in this new nationalist ideology? Because of the dramatic characteristics, this unique characteristics of the events that are happening in this war that leaves very little doubt as to the motivations and the happenings, the events of what's happening, without conducting a sociological survey, I would say that it leaves most of the Russian-speaking Israelis, whether they're ex-Russian, Ukraine, Belarus, or it leaves them all on the side of the weaker side, the vulnerable side, the victim. And just as in most parts of the Western world, we see almost total empathy with the Ukraine, obviously with a few exceptions, whether it's Serbia or the right or extreme left in Germany and France. Also in Israel, other than very few exceptions, the perception is very one-sided that Russia invaded Ukraine and started the war and is hurting the life there. So in the beginning, when I spoke about these cases, we spoke about if there would be clashes between those who speak Russian and Ukrainian. I assumed in the beginning that this would not be the case. As in 2014, this battle was real. It also touched the Russian media in Israel, including Channel 9. I know because back then I worked in Channel 9 before I started in the Knesset. There was complaints received about journalists who identified too much with the Ukrainian side. There was an effort to fire one of the journalists who used symbols of Bandera live. She wore a t-shirt with these symbols. The world in general was more divided regarding the motivations in the events of this operation. But in Israel, the involvement was much smaller. There wasn't as much coverage in the media. Obviously, they were dramatic, but because they were short and the war did not draw as much attention, not in the world and also not in Israel, there wasn't as much coverage. There weren't a lot of journalists in there. The coverage was focused on the community, Ukrainian language media, witnesses, social media that stirred up both sides. And it was more of a community issue that did not erupt outside. There were just very few articles in Israel that I remember in the mainstream Israeli media, but not a full-on coverage. Now we see the community coming together, those that are assisting, collecting, coming together to assist also in their efforts. also contributing and volunteering towards the Ukraine. This is different from what we saw in 2014. On the other side, there is a community trauma. I see people who came with me in my Aliyah, and others who were educated here and barely speak the language, and suddenly they are exposed and connected to these dramatic events. These places that did not mean much to average Israelis, but also to those who were born here or came when they were young. Some of these names came out of everybody's mouth. This thing is not a community thing, but it became a community disconnect for those who have family or friends, obviously to those who came from the Ukraine and have distant family there or friends, work connections. Thousands of Israelis worked there or managed businesses there. But beyond the effect on finances or a friend or a family member, there is a community identification with these people who became victims of this war, also in the Ukraine and also in Russia, and were forced to run and leave their lives. And it feels a lot closer to home, a lot closer to the souls. Even if there was not a lot of coverage to the life there, but it causes a lot of feelings, evokes a lot of feelings to people who in the past were not interested in their past, some of them even trying to avoid them and become completely Israelis. Suddenly they went through some kind of connections, an old country, through this traumatic event of war. There are very interesting phenomena in the last few weeks of immigrants or people who are here many years who were very active on social media and wrote in Russian, but they're from the Ukraine, and they write in Facebook and Telegram in Belarus or in Russian, but suddenly there's a renaissance of these languages. I know of an event where they were looking for a translator into sign language, Ukrainian Sign Language, and they couldn't find because there isn't. And suddenly now there is an effort to run away from the Russian language, the language of the empire, and to try to come closer to the languages that are identified with smaller communities, identified with the struggle for the Ukraine against the dictator, against Putin's war. And so that is on this subject, and of course if there are any questions I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you very much. So now we will move to Dr. Shtakser. If you're here.
Okay.
I hope you can hear me now. Great, wonderful. Okay, so I will start. The impression from the discourse of both sides in the current war in Ukraine is that they are refighting in World War II, with both the Russians and the Ukrainians fighting with the Red Army against an enemy perceived as Nazis. I will try to explain the meaning and the importance of this discourse regarding the Ukrainian side. For this side, I argue that this discourse constitutes a significant change in the perception of collective memory. With the onset of the current war, there's been a fundamental change in the Ukrainian discourse regarding the people and their country. On the eve of the war, the discourse on Ukrainian nationalism was dominated by accepted perception in Western Ukraine, a relatively small and less industrialized area, which the commitment to the Ukrainian national idea for reasons of continued national oppressions, first by the Poles and later by the Soviet invaders, was much more exclusive, certainly more than in other territories of Ukraine. These perceptions relied on historical memory of the Ukrainian national struggle against the Poles, against the Russians, and later against the Soviets. This memory, according to historian Georgy Kasyanov, was shaped into a coherent nationalist and anti-Soviet discourse by Ukrainian immigrants who constructed it for many years in Canada and the United States and brought it to the Ukraine as a ready-made single national ideology for the new state. This ideology was accepted in the west of the country because it tasted the historical memory in this area. Later, it was accepted with the support of the various governments who saw nationalism as the unifying factor of the new state. The national heroes were the ones who fought for Ukrainian independence. From Bogdan Khmelnytsky to Ukrainian political prisoners under the Soviet rule. Although part of this discourse was clearly pro-Western and anti-Russian in orientation, Ukrainian nationalists, who for some time collaborated with the Nazis and took an active role in the Holocaust, were not removed from the list of heroes. The reason was not necessarily contempt of the Holocaust, but a lack of other heroes who fought specifically for the independence of the Ukrainian nation. After all, in all opinion polls, support for the far right, which unreservedly championed the views of these nationalists, has always been minimal. However, such a historical memory inevitably created tension between Ukraine and other countries that fought the Nazis during World War II. The historical memory also caused constant tension within the state of Ukraine, as it severely affected a very large part of the Ukrainian population that before World War II was part of the Soviet state and whose sons, almost without exception, fought in the Red Army against the Nazis. This part of the Ukrainian population did not have, after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, a unique concept of Ukrainian nationalists that they could use as their own alternative. However, the memory of their struggle and victory against the Nazis is a very significant part of their self-identity. The heroes of this war are heroes of this population, and their gradual removal from official concepts of Ukrainian heroism made them constantly feel that the state removes them and their historical memory from Ukrainian historical memory and makes them as second-class citizens. For example, according to polls, about 89% of respondents in the Ukraine opposed the decommunization laws passed in May 2015, which included a ban on Soviet symbols, side by side with Nazi symbols, a comparison that many in the Ukraine did not accept, as well as a legitimization of the Ukrainian nationalist organizations that collaborated with the Nazis. This too was not received sympathetically by those citizens of the Ukraine who among them, in almost every family, lost someone in the war against the Nazis. In addition, until the beginning of the war, many of them sympathized with Russia, considering the closeness of both in the terms of historical memory and in terms of common culture and language. Ukrainians from these regions, even after Ukraine became independent, saw Leningrad and Moscow as their cultural centers. Their historical memory was much closer to the historical memory of the Russians, based largely on the Soviet victory against Nazism, rather than to the historical memory of Ukrainians from the west of the country. A very large proportion of them felt uncomfortable with the dominant Ukrainian nationalism and believed it threatened their cultural identity. In terms of historical memory, they also felt very uncomfortable about attacks by a small but vocal section of Ukrainian nationalists on their pride in a victory over the Nazis as part of the Red Army. These people saw themselves as Ukrainians and wanted the independence of the Ukraine. According to opinion polls, their sense as Ukrainians intensified following the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula and following the war in the Lugansk and Donetsk regions, which was rightly perceived as a non-Russian attack against Ukraine. Their problem was that the Ukrainian state failed to integrate its historical memory into the historical memory of the new Ukrainian state. This was also a problem of the state. A state in which powerful and contradictory historical memories coexist is necessarily an unstable state. This is a weakness that the Russian Federation has examined and which it has tried to exploit in an attempt to take over, if not officially, the Lugansk and Donetsk districts in the Donetsk region. It is also a weakness that may have encouraged the Russian Federation to think that in the current war, the Russians will gain much more sympathy in Ukraine than has actually happened. Instead, the current war has done what the Ukrainian state has failed to do throughout its existence. It has succeeded in creating a Ukrainian identity that combines the historical memory of the two Ukrainian populations, East and West, into a new historical memory just built around the struggle for independence against a stronger and richer state. It also managed to incorporate into the Ukrainian historical memory new heroes, whose work does not harm the image of Ukrainian nationalism in light of cooperation with the Nazis. In other words, Ukraine is currently building a new historical memory in it that is common to all Ukrainians. Of course, this is not to say that the Ukraine has become an overnight culturally homogeneous country. This type of homogeneity is not possible and, in my opinion, undesirable. But it seems that the Ukraine will emerge from the war as a much stronger state, since during the war and to win the war, the Ukrainians have adopted a unifying discourse. This is a very different situation from a situation in which a large part of the population regularly feels alienated from the dominant discourse of the country, a situation that existed before the war. The most significant change I have seen since the beginning of the war is the realm of the historical memory. The historical memory of the Ukrainians from the territories of the former Soviet Union became dominant. We stopped hearing about Ukrainian nationalists from the Second World War period, whose actual debate, whether against and whether in favor, hardly left the Ukrainian media before the start of the war. The question of these as heroes of Ukraine did not go away, but it ceased to be central in the public debate. Instead, the same historical memory of the Ukrainians who fought in the Red Army against the Nazis, who remembered the occupation and destruction of their country during this period, and who, although were both collaborators and quite a few anti-Semitic manifestations at the time, hardly joined Ukrainian nationalist organizations who chose to share action with the Nazis, became dominant. This dominance was inevitable, since the war took place almost exclusively in the eastern and southern regions of Ukraine. Those regions, which were part of the Soviet Union and whose inhabitants, to this day, often prefer to speak Russian rather than
יש לך עוד
Ukrainian.
2 דקות.
I'm sorry to disturb you, you have 2 more minutes. Many have already noticed that the rhetoric of the war in the Ukraine is quite strange. Both Russia and the Ukraine make massive use of World War II mentions to describe their war against the other side. Russia has, for many years, even before the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, claimed that the Ukrainian national heroes are in fact collaborators with the Nazis, and that their views of these heroes underlie Ukrainian nationalism. These accusations, as in many cases of political accusations, which underlie these of other interests, are partly justified and partly, in fact, in the more significant part, unjustified. It is justified to argue that the large part of the Ukrainian pre-war national and official recognized heroes were collaborators with the Nazis. It is not justified to claim that the Ukrainian state has adapted their racist and anti-democratic conceptions as the basis of their nationality. Ukraine is a country with a strong commitment to democracy, and although racism and anti-Semitism certainly exist in it, it tries to fight them both through legislation and through attempts to influence public opinion. Specifically, several months before the start of the war, a law against anti-Semitism was enacted in Ukraine, and the memorial site in Babi Yar, where the Germans executed the vast majority of Kiev Jews, though not yet complete, was open to visitors. The newest and more significant thing is happening regarding the descriptions of the war on the Ukrainian side. President Zelensky, as well as the mayors of attacked cities, left behind the deliberately vague perception of the Red Army struggle against the Nazis and adopted an equivocal discourse that their defense against Russia was a repetition of Soviet Ukraine's war as part of the Red Army against the Nazis. When mayors compared their attacked and besieged cities to Stalingrad and mentioned that the Nazis in their time brought destruction and sacrifice to those cities, they adopt a uniquely powerful discourse in all the areas of the former Soviet Union. I'm really sorry that I have to stop you, but thank you. Thank you.
קארל, אתה איתנו? קארל? יבגני?
כן.
אני רואה שאתה גם בשליטה על המערכת, אז אולי בא זאב וחטף את קארל, אז אולי פשוט נתקדם בינתיים?
כן, מי הדובר הבא?
אני הדובר הבא, אז אני יכול להזמין את עצמי לבמה ולדבר כאילו.
אני פשוט, הגדירו אותי כקו-הוסט כדי שאני אוכל לשתף.
יפה, אז תראה איך המלוכה נפלה בידיך בלי שתכננת.
בשמחה, אז אני...
לא יודע מה, אני חושב שהמחשב...
So I think that Carl's computer has crashed. It happens, but we in the center start on time and finish on time, so I hope everything is okay there, but we'll continue.
אוקיי, אז הדיון האחרון
So the
שלנו
last
הוא
discussion
על ההקבלה
is about the
ששומעים אותה
comparison that we've heard
מאז פרוץ
many
המלחמה,
times
ובעצם
since
אפילו
the start
לפני
of
כן,
the war,
בין
but even before.
זלנסקי לרולנד
The
רייגן,
comparison between Ronald Reagan and
שחקנים
Zelensky
לשעבר
as two ex-actors
שהפכו למנהיגים,
that became leaders,
ומי
presidents,
שהתייצבו מול אימפריית
and
הרשע,
two leaders who stood
עם מירכאות
before
ובלי מירכאות.
the evil
אבל לפני
power,
שאני מאוד
with
מאוד
quotations,
בקצרה
without
אגע בנושא הזה,
quotations.
אני חייב לומר
But
לכם,
before I start this,
אני אומר אותו
I'd like
יותר
to say
מהבטן,
something. I'm going to say this from my gut, more from my gut than from my head, and sometimes it's better that way.
חלק מהמוזיקה שהייתה בדיון היום, שלום
A
קארל.
few of the things.
שלום, סליחה.
חשבנו שמישהו חטף אותך,
Hi,
אולי
Carl. I
האקרים
thought somebody
רוסים, או
kidnapped
כל
you,
דבר
maybe
אחר,
some
אבל
Russian hackers.
המחשב חטף אותך. בסדר,
The
שום
computer
דבר לא תמים. תשמעו, אני אגיד את
kidnapped
זה
me.
בצורה הכי בוטה.
So I'm going to say this
במרכז
bluntly.
שלנו אומרים את הדברים כמו שהם,
Sometimes in our
יש גם
center we say
ויכוחים
things
סוערים
as they are,
בצורה
and
הכי-
many times we have a
חלק
lot of
מהמוזיקה,
debate and
של הדברים
arguments.
שנאמרו כאן,
Some of the
היא
things that were
בעיניי
said
לא
today
נכונה ופגומה מוסרית.
I
ואני אגיד
think are
בדיוק למה אני מתכוון.
morally flawed,
כולנו
and
חברים טובים לפני ונשאר חברים טובים אחרי, אני אגיד בדיוק
we're
למה
all
אני מתכוון.
friends. We've been friends before, and we'll stay friends
השאלה,
later.
מה עשו אוקראינים בשואה?
The question of what the Ukrainians did during the Holocaust and
לגבי מה שהם עשו
what
בשואה,
they tell themselves
הם לא
now
הראשונים
about
שעושים
what
את
they
זה, והם
did
כנראה גם לא
during the
האחרונים.
Holocaust
היא שאלה חשובה מאוד.
is an important question.
היא לא חשובה כרגע.
However, it is not important now. It is not important at
משום
all.
שכרגע
Because now
יש אומה
there is a
שנאבקת על
nation
חייה
that is fighting for
מול
their lives
פשעי מלחמה,
before war crimes
בהוראה
time,
ישירה של
under a
דיקטטור
direct
אכזר,
order from a
פושע
cruel
מלחמה,
dictator
שמאיים על הסדר העולמי
who is threatening the entire world
שום
order.
דבר אחר לא חשוב. זה הכל
Nothing
הסחות
else
דעת,
is important.
בחלקן יש אפילו בעיניי צלצול לא נעים
Some of them just
של
don't even
עיסוק
sound
בעצמנו שאנחנו לא
well
הנושא.
and a
עניין
focus on ourselves
דבר שני,
when we are
אני
not
שמתי לב
important.
שיש לישראל נטייה
This is one
לדבר על
thing.
מה שקורה באוקראינה
The second tendency
בלשון סבילה.
is a
בפסק.
tendency in Israel to talk
יש
in
שיירות,
passive.
יש הרוגים,
There are
לא.
convoys, there are people being
יש
killed.
רוצחים
No,
ויש
there are
נרצחים.
murders and there are
הרוצחים הם
people being murdered.
רוסים שפועלים
The
בהוראת
murderers
נשיא,
are
הרבה
Russians
פעמים
who are
אפשר
doing
להעריך
this
בלית
under the
ברירה.
command
צריך
of uh,
לזכור, גם לחיילים הרוסים
president.
יש אימהות,
We need to
הם לא
understand
אשמים במצבם,
that some of them are
בוודאי לא
not
החיילים
responsible for
הפשוטים.
their situation. Some of
אבל
them
יש
are doing
רוצחים,
this with no other
והרוצחים
choice.
הם
But there
רוסים בהוראת
are
פוטין, ויש
murderers
נרצחים
and they are
הנרצחים
Russians and there are
כל
those
דבר
being
אחר
murdered
זילות
and they
מוסרית.
are Ukrainian people.
עכשיו
And
לנקודה
anything
האחרונה,
else is
שאלת
immoral to
ההשוואה.
say. The last point
אולי באופן
is
כללי
the
השוואות
point of
בהיסטוריה זה דבר
comparison.
בעייתי.
Comparison in history is a
השוואות לשואה
problematic
הם
thing.
בוודאי דבר בעייתי.
And a
משום שהיא
comparison to the
פשע
Holocaust
מיוחד
is
וייחודי בהיסטוריה.
very problematic because it's
אבל
so
השואה
unique.
לא
But
התרחשה בחלל.
the Holocaust did not happen in a void.
אפילו בבתי הספר התיכוניים
Even in
שלנו
high
לא
school,
מלמדים את זה.
they don't
השואה
teach
לא
this
התרחשה
any
בחלל.
longer. The
היא
Holocaust
הייתה
did not
חלק
occur
מתהליך של
in a
פשיזציה
void.
של
It
חברות
was part
תרבותיות,
of the fascist movement of
של פגיעה
cultural societies, of
בעיקרון שחיי אדם קדושים,
an effect to the
של גבולות
principle
בינלאומיים
that human
מוכרים.
life
צריך
is
לכבד.
sacred and that you need to respect international borders.
והרקע הזה
And this is the background
יצר התגלגלות
that
של
created a series of events
בסופם הנאציזם
that in the
הגיע
end allowed Nazism
להוויה המפלצתית
to become
והנוראה ביותר. זה לא
this
קרה מעצמו.
monstrous, to come into existence. It didn't happen on its own. And
כשאנחנו
that's why a
רואים היום
comparison
באירופה,
is important. When we see
מנהיג
today in
שמפיץ
Europe
רעיונות של
a
פולק
leader
מדומיין,
who spreads
שלא מכיר בזכות של
false
עמים
folk
אחרים
that doesn't
להתקיים.
recognize the right
יוצא
of other
למלחמה,
nations to
מבצע
exist,
פשעי
goes
מלחמה
out
לבד
to
משפטנים
war,
בכירים.
executes
מבצע
war
פשעים נגד
crimes against humanity,
וההשוואה בוודאי
and a
רלוונטית.
comparison is definitely relevant.
אגב, לא
If
חייבים
we
תמיד,
have
אבל
to
אם
bring
חייבים.
in the Jewish question, we
בסופו
don't always
של
have to,
דבר,
but
לאורך
if we
ההיסטוריה,
have to,
היה רק סוג אחד
throughout
של חברות
history, there was
שבהם
only
יהודים
one type
היו
of society in which the Jewish people were protected
טבח,
from massacres
אלימות שיטתית.
and
אנטישמיות
violence.
הייתה כמעט בכל מקום.
Anti-Semitism was
אבל
everywhere.
הגנה ליהודים
But
מפני
protection
מאבק
for
כאומה
the Jewish
שם
people
הייתה
from
באופן
persecution
מוחלט
as a
רק במשטרים
nation
ליברליים דמוקרטיים.
only existed in
נכון,
liberal
לא כל
democratic
המשטרים
regimes.
הפשיסטים פעלו נגד יהודים.
Not all
אבל הגנה
fascist
ליהודים,
regimes
ערבות
were
לקיומם
fought
הייתה
against
רק
the Jews,
במשטרים ליברליים
but
דמוקרטיים.
protection only came from
ולכן
liberal
כשבא אדם
democratic
פוטין,
regimes. And therefore,
פושע
when
מלחמה
a
פוטין,
man, a
שבא
criminal,
פושע
a war
מלחמה
criminal
פוטין,
like Putin, shows up
ומערער על הסדר
and he
שנותן הגנה
destabilizes the
ליהודים
order that
בעולם.
provides protection to the
האיש
Jewish
הזה
people,
מסוכן
this
לכל
order
קהילה
since the
יהודית
Second
בעולם. ולכן,
World War. This man is
הדבר הכי
dangerous.
בלתי נסבל
to the Jewish community everywhere. And therefore, the thing that I find most unbearable is not those that support Putin. I see talkbacks. Okay, so he has supporters. There are fascists, and there are those who support fascists everywhere. Those who are neutral drive me crazy. Don't be neutral. What is the worth of all the training and lectures and the moral preaching that we've all heard in school when in this situation people can be neutral? How is this possible? We're now nearing the Holocaust Remembrance Day, and in schools they will learn about Britain's moral blindness. That could have sent planes, they could have bombed concentration camps and didn't bother to do this. For goodness sake, there are Jewish organizations that are not even sending out a statement of condemnation, forget sending planes. How are we going to look at this in a year, in 10 years? How are people not ashamed? And now to the main topic of discussion. So there is a sentence that repeats itself, almost like a cliche. Reagan, the actor who became a president and won the Cold War. And there are a few issues with this statement. Everything is maybe accurate factually, but not completely. One mistake that you won't really hear the Americans do, this picture of Reagan, an actor, who wasn't so successful, and then one day the stupid Americans elected him. That's not true. Reagan was a senior, admired actor. He was admired, and this was the beginning of a public political career. It was impressive and comprehensive. He was the president of the Actors Union. This was not a role of little importance. He was the president of the Actors Union. Later on, he became the main presenter of General Electric. And in this role, he delivered motivation speeches, speeches of unity and economic freedoms. He met thousands of Americans and learned how to talk to them. Then he was elected to be the governor of California twice. California, if it leaves the U.S., is a huge country. To be the governor of California is not a little thing. He ran twice to be the Republican Party nominee, and then the third time in 1980, he was their presidential candidate, and he won in a landslide. This is a rich political career. This isn't an actor who became president. How much was it his acting skills that turned him to president? Yes, we lived in a different era where not everyone knew how the TV works. Not everyone knew how to stand in front of the camera, and not everyone had charisma, but I recommend that you watch some of Reagan's appearances, some of his presidential debates. He started quite old, quite tired. I don't find a lot of charisma. It's possible that he won because before him stood a very weak candidate, and because he had ideas that Americans back then and also today felt they could connect with. He didn't win because he was an actor and he casted a spell. He won because he was a serious politician. The next cliche is that he won the Cold War. On this, there is a lot of debate between historians. I would be very interested to hear Evgeni and Uriya and Ksenia and their opinion about this question and how it looks from the Russian equation. But I think there is agreement that Reagan's moral clarity, his ability to do what for some reason is so difficult for people to do these days, to understand that there is evil. There are no angels, but there is evil. This had a big role in the Soviet downfall that came not long after his rise to power. The Star Wars program that was not realistic, but it played a role in the Soviets' understanding that they could not compete with the West. But I don't think there is a historian that would not say that the main reason of the Soviet downfall is the internal decay. It was a sick society, just as Russia is sick today. Russia of today may even be sicker. Russia of today is a kleptocracy. There are a group of gangsters that caught rule. But also the Soviet Union was sick. And it fell even without one shot because of the rise to power of one man, a special man, that we almost forget about, Mikhail Gorbachev. So that was about Reagan. Now Zelensky, because the comparison between them is inviting. Zelensky is a different story. Zelensky is a man who you couldn't write a screenplay, a script about, like the reality is created. And this sentence in itself is ironic because he came to the presidency from a script. The story is known to everyone. He was a comedian, an actor in comedies, a producer. He won the Ukrainian Dancing with Stars, and following a successful show in which he played a president who fights corruption, he decided that he wanted to be a president who would fight corruption. So far, this is a fantastic story. The era in which we live in, with social media, when TV is a thing of the past, it's completely different from the time of Reagan. Today, Zelensky's abilities to stand in front of the television doesn't make him special, and honestly, I don't think he has much charisma. But the fact is that there is a man who jumped almost suddenly from being an actor with no political experience to being a president. I would just warn to undermine this ability. He was elected as the youngest man to be elected in the Ukraine. He was 41, and he won with the most majority, with more than 71%, and he was the first Jew to be elected. A man with no political qualifications can't accomplish all this. There is one saying that they say about Zelensky, and with this I will end. They say that because he didn't have political qualifications, just a background of a producer and actor, because of this he fell into traps and he made strategic mistakes, and he didn't give in to them, and he insisted to join NATO, and he forced Putin to go into war. This is complete nonsense. When you see the Russian war developments, whoever listened to Putin's rhetoric, also in translations, but whoever listened to him in the last 10 years, Putin refused to see the Ukraine as an independent country. He was willing to maybe accept it as a protectorate. Putin started a war that was not designed to take control over Russian lands, but he went out to war to take complete control of the Ukraine. And if Zelensky had given in to the so-called innocent request not to join NATO, Russia would have destroyed the Ukraine. And whoever does the comparison, yes, you can do the comparison. You should do it. This is exactly what happened to another small country. Not that Ukraine is a small country, but to the Czech Republic. We remember the time, we remember the results. The world, I think, in 10 years will be grateful to Zelensky an actor, not an actor, the role of his life or not, but the world will thank him for standing before the evil empire. He led the Ukraine to a war that hindered Putin's plans to renew a Russian hegemony over Eastern Europe. This, of course, every Jew with awareness, with consciousness, with understanding of the Second World War and of the crimes of the Nazis, this, of course, every Jew with a historical awareness should understand and act accordingly. So thank you for such a large attendance. Thank you to all those who have attended. Carl, I'm returning to you so we can finish up. Thank you to everyone. I'm sorry for the technical issues that caused me to disappear for a while. But thank you for everyone who joined us tonight. The recording will be available on our website and on YouTube tonight. So thank you very much and good evening. Thank you.